It's nearly 2 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place, and the sanctions that were imposed by the EU and other Western governments have had a major impact on how Russia trades, on with whom Russia trades, and certainly in terms of technical developments. Organic and chemical and polymer exports, for example, have been mostly blocked into Europe, whilst imports of European technology and US technology for the petrochemical industry have been completely frozen. Self-sanctioning has also been a major factor, causing supply challenges for higher raw materials and catalysts. This has forced Russia to undertake many changes in the way it buys things, develops things, and looked at its own industry from a different perspective. Trade dynamics have been affected significantly because the European markets have closed and Russia has basically realigned most of its marketing towards China. Most of its trade is now conducted in the Far East, and that has involved higher costs, higher lead times, and completely different strategies. Whereas there has been some impact on production of chemicals and polymers in Russia following the imposition of sanctions and other embargoes that have affected producers, generally speaking, production has performed relatively well over the past 12 to 18 months. There was an initial downturn probably in the third quarter last year, but generally speaking, the production has exceeded last year's levels, and 2023 hasn't been such an awful year for Russian producers. And we look at the first graphic, you can see that ethylene has made a slight increase, benzene's made an increase, and so has butanols. The biggest decline has been seen in methanol. In plastics, we've seen rises in overall production, driven mainly by polyethylene and the demand for pipes in the water and gas programs being undertaken by the Russian government. The big falls, if any, have been seen in synthetic rubber production, due partly to Western sanctions and also the loss of tyre producing capacity, and also methanol production, where all methanol producers have encountered some sort of difficulties in adjusting from the European market to other markets. The impact on trade has been quite significant. In terms of imports from Russia, China has increased polypropylene imports almost twofold in the first 10 months this year. Polyethylene imports from Russia started in the third and fourth quarters in 2022 to rise quite sharply, but then started to fall away. And now, back into 2023, they've actually dropped due to increased consumption in the Russian market. Imports of synthetic rubber from Russia into China have risen sharply this year also, mainly because of the loss of European business, which is still can continue technically until June 24, but the producers have already elected to choose the Chinese market as a replacement. Methanol exports to China have also been designed to keep the Russian producers, in full occupancy or close to full occupancy. That they've replaced the European market share, which was previously undertaken through the Finnish ports. Whilst Russian exports to China have increased dramatically in the last 12 to 18 months, the same can be said of imports of Chinese products into Russia, particularly things like the car industry have actually flourished dramatically. But in terms of chemicals, Chinese exports of MDI and polyols have filled gaps that were previously held by European suppliers. And also we can look at polyethylene exports from China into Russia, filling the gaps of the more specialist polyethylene grades, such as ethylene vinyl acetate, ethylene alpha olefins, etc. The chemical industry occupies less than 5% of Russian GDP, and thus sanctions in their direct form can only have a limited effect on the Russian economy as a whole and are very unlikely to have any influence in ending the war in Ukraine. Indirectly, the effects of sanctions are more far-reaching, breaking the links in raw material and supply chains for Russian chemical producers, whilst creating production and processing difficulties for consuming industries such as automotive, construction and paints. EU sanctions have been concentrated mostly on polymers and organic chemical commodities, whilst other areas of trade have been unaffected, such as fertilizers, household chemicals. Despite the difficulties caused by sanctions, Russian chemical production has performed relatively well in the past year, particularly compared to some European markets. As discussed in this presentation, access to Western markets has changed the dynamics of Russia's foreign trade in chemicals and polymers, both for export and import. From a strategic perspective, sanctions on the chemical industry have affected investment and access to Western expertise and technology. Many projects have been cancelled, shelved, or simply postponed. Some things have been overcome, such as catalyst buy and some raw materials that were previously accessed from the West. Overall, Russia cannot survive without Western technology if it wants to develop a modern petrochemical industry over the next 10 years. As a rule, Russian industry likes to put on a brave face by stating that sanctions present no problem. For now, the industry remains intact, but much depends on future relations with China and trade, and also the state of the Russian economy and how it fares under a wartime management of an autocratic government. If you'd like to have any comments below, please do.